Just to give you a brief explanation of the research project that is overarching for this report. The objective at the beginning, it's an idea that I got when I went to WHO. So when I was at the WHO, I received an interesting comment from a few representative of member states saying that, and that's more than 6 years ago. So keep that in mind. It was before even the pandemic. But he said, well, they put a lot of efforts, in all the work that they do for WHO and the delegation that he sent at the WHO, and they were becoming increasing concern about the real impact of their work. They wanted to have data about, does it really have the full impact that we're hoping through the work that we do? And there was a general movement at that time as well regarding WHO's interest in increasing accountability and really measuring its impact. So this project is really, I would say, a continuation of that concern of how can we really have a better understanding of the actual impact of all the important work that WHO does. And we also have a historical moment, I would say, right now with the adoption of the pandemic agreement. This has been a very challenging and demanding task. And I think it's a very important realization, especially in a context where there's less and less appetite for international agreement worldwide. So I think we should really acknowledge all the important work that has been done for this pandemic agreement. And it's also is important to acknowledge the work that we did with this research. It continues to really understand the impact of what we do, and it will be especially important considering this pandemic agreement. So next slide, please. So very briefly, the objective of the broader research project that we work on for many years, it was first to really assess how WHO norms travel from the international level into domestic law. And we wanted to do that by measuring it from a quantitative and qualitative perspective. And we're going to give you more details about that later. We also wanted to respond to a lack of data in this field, and I mentioned that at the beginning, that member states were concerned about this, but even in the research, it was something that was coming constantly, like we really need more data to understand the impact of different part of WHO's work, but especially the normative component, so the different norms that are adopted by WHO. At the end of the day, what we wanted to do with the research is also to develop theoretical and empirical knowledge on the normative effectiveness of the work produced by WHO. And we were hoping to have especially knowledge for the WHO, but we thought that we could gain knowledge for other international organizations as well, knowing that they have differences as well that we need to take into account. And at the end of the day, what we also want to do is make recommendation to help with the global health governance and perhaps help WHO in that endeavor and member states. Next slides. Very briefly again, the methodology that we use for this project. First of all, we really work on a theoretical framework. So we identify what we already have in the literature and research from a broader perspective, not only WHO, but what we know from other international organizations, including WHO, on the different factors that impact how norms travel from the international level, from domestic law. The second part of the methodology, it was looking for references of WHO normative instrument in domestic law. We look at different countries, 7 countries, if I remember well. And also what we did is really look into regulation, legislation, and case law. When WHO's norms were cited, in which context. So we had an analytical grid for that, and we looked at nearly 6,000 references. Then we conducted semi-structured interviews to complement the 2 previous phases to have even more knowledge about that process of norms traveling from one level to another. And we conducted interviews with 46 key informants either at the international level, so some working for WHO, but other international organizations, but also with key stakeholders from the domestic countries that we were looking at. And at the end of the day, the final step that we have been working on is really to build on all this knowledge that we gained from the previous phases to do a comparative analysis of all the domestic cases, so the different states that we look at, to revisit our theoretical analysis and knowledge that we have about how the norms travel from one level to another, but also to embark into that task of making recommendations for WHO. So it's all this process that we did we work on for many years. And today we are presenting part of this research. Okay, so now we're going to start presenting the different data that we collected throughout the years, and we're going to do that by focusing on the different countries that we looked at. And so each speaker is going to present one of the country. For Brazil, it's going to be Miriam Cohen. So I have some bios. I'm going to go with a very short presentation because they all have very impressive and long bios. So just to start with Miriam, she is an associate professor and she holds a Canada Research Chair on Human Rights and International Reparative Justice at the University of Montreal Faculty of Law. She teaches and researches in international public and human rights law. She is the founder of Human Rights and International Justice Lab, where she supervises interdisciplinary research teams developing a specialized digital platform for the analysis of human rights jurisprudence. So Miriam, the floor is yours. And what we're going to do is to give each speaker around 7 minutes for their presentation. And then at the end, after Professor Habibi presentation, we're going to take questions that you can put in the chat. And we have hopefully time for that. So thank you very much, Miriam. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katherine. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's such a delight to present the data of this report, such an important project. We've worked for many years, like Katherine was saying, and I think the result is even more than what we had hoped for, and I think it will have a great impact on the field. So I'll present Brazil. It's a country that I'm actually originally from, but I have to say that I'm not a complete expert because I moved out quite early in my career, in my life. So just a couple of notes of context. So Brazil is a federal constitutional republic, currently based on a constitution dated October 5, 1988. It's the most populous country in Latin America and the Caribbean. And the executive power is based on a presidential regime, in which an elected president is both the head of state and the head of government. In terms of the judicial system, because then we'll talk about some data on the judicial system, the judiciary is based on 3 levels of jurisdictions: courts of first instance, courts of second instance, and the 3rd level of jurisdiction is constituted by common justice and special courts, so Superior Tribunal of Justice and Military Tribunal, the Superior Electoral Tribunal and Superior Labor Tribunal, and the Supreme Federal Tribunal is also part of this 3rd level of jurisdiction. The legal tradition of Brazil is civil law, and in terms of international law, the federal government exercises exclusive authority over the treaty-making process. Regarding international treaties, the Brazilian legal system can be classified as a moderate dualism, and in the sense of the Constitution, on the conclusion of international agreements, the resulting charges or commitments that go against the national properties, the National Congress must approve through a legislative decree. And just to complete that kind of contextual panorama, international custom is directly applicable in domestic law. The healthcare system in Brazil is a social right according to the Brazilian Constitution, so universal right and a state responsibility. So Brazil has a universal public health system called SUS, Sistema Único de Saúde, and it's based on the principle of universal right to comprehensive healthcare, the decentralization of healthcare responsibilities, and community participation in federal, state, and municipal health councils. So in terms of Brazil and global health, it has been a member of the WHO since 1948, and it's an active member of PAHO and is responsible for hosting 19 WHO collaborating centers within its territory. So having mentioned these contextual notes, then if we go into the results of the research, two preliminary points are emphasized in the report. The data in Brazil were sampled following the repartition rules outlined in the methodology section, and as Katherine has already mentioned briefly, and the search in the Diário Oficial da União database, which are for laws and regulations between 2018 and 2021. And that was carried out by our partners in Brazil. So I believe they couldn't be here today, and that's why I'm presenting this part of the research. So I'll start with also an expert opinion by Professor Paula Almeida. She mentions that for regulations and laws, the contrast is very expressive. 2,422,393,000 individual federal government publications were identified in the period analyzed. And that's interesting if we look at also other points of data that I'll mention briefly. So the type of instrument that has achieved the most results in Brazil is the court decisions type of instrument, so 722 results. A few laws citing the WHO were found in Brazil, and that may be explained by the challenges that were associated with the databases that we used. Regulations obtained a significant number of results, 196 results. So we have some graphs that are all these different ministries and the different data and types of instrument we can find. So that would be in pages 18 and forward, 18, 19, and so forth. In terms of number of cases, I'll cite another expert opinion that is mentioned in the report. And Professor Almeida says, given the number of cases decided each year, it would be natural for the STJ, so the Superior Tribunal de Justiça, to present more cases that cite the WHO. However, it should also be noted that the law 9.656/98, which deals with healthcare plans, expressly cites the WHO in one of its articles, Article 10, increasing the number of citations. So going forward again with more expert opinions, and then just a brief conclusion, because I'm conscious of the time here. There was an increase in citations after 2013, which is interesting, and it reached a peak in 2018 when the court faced several issues related to alcoholism. And this number shows a big increase in 2020, which is not surprising given the COVID pandemic and the increase in citations to the organizations in the country. So just to conclude, and referring back to the report, so in contrast to other federal states that will be mentioned today and that are mentioned in the report, Brazil is the sole federal state in which the federal level possesses the most responsibility and jurisdiction over health-related matters. And the data that we collected reveals that at the federal level, references to the WHO were found in a large number of national instruments. In terms of the data distribution, that we have some charts in the report to kind of illustrate the data more clearly. Similar to other states, court decisions account for the largest proportion of the results. And it should be noted that unlike laws, regulations in Brazil are significant. So unlike other countries, only the decisions of Brazil's two Supreme Courts have been collected. So that's an important point to bear in mind when reading the data. And in this regard, a certain disparity can be observed since the STJ is one of the largely citing authorities citing the WHO. References to the WHO over time highlight a general increase in citations to this international organization, which is, as I mentioned before, unsurprisingly, when we think about the COVID-19 pandemics. And this is despite the fact, and that was an interesting point that we learned with this research, that the head of state at the time presented a certain hostility and some pause regarding the WHO. Other major health issues, I've also mentioned alcoholism can also explain the increase in references to the WHO. In times of crisis, seem to be a catalyst for the use of WHO norms in Brazil. So that's one of our report's conclusions. So I think I'll stop here to keep up with the time and to give the floor, I guess, to the next speaker presenting the data, which I believe is Pierre Larouche. So the floor is yours, or Katherine, if you wanna introduce him first. Thank you
Yes,
very much for your attention.
thank you very much, Miriam. And we're going to have time for questions at the end. That's why we're keeping track of the time. So next, yes, it's Pierre Larouche. So Pierre Larouche is an expert in competition law, economic governance, and civil liability within the traditions of civil and common law. Pierre is a full professor in law and innovation at the Faculty of Law at the University of Montreal, so a colleague, a wonderful colleague of mine. And before he was a professor in competition law at Tilburg University in the Netherlands, where he co-founded the Tilburg Law and Economics Center, a world-leading research center in economic governance. He's also an expert in comparative law. So Pierre, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Katherine, for the introduction. So I will present now the Canadian part of the report. What you see immediately at the start of the chapter is, of course, Canada is a G7 country and fits within the box that we would label the global north. Now, you will have seen also that there are some specificities in the Canadian constitutional structure that make us relatively self-centered about health policy. There's no constitutional right to healthcare or anything like this, but as you saw in the report, next to the provinces that are running the show mostly in relation to health and healthcare, there's a strong federal involvement via the financing power and via legislation that essentially tells the provinces, well, if you want the money that you need to run your systems, this is what you need to do. This is how the system should be run. And that has turned health policy into some kind of significant federal area of endeavor, even though the federal government doesn't run the health institutions, but it definitely dictates some of the parameters. And again, as we don't have a constitutional right to health in our constitution, but it didn't prevent health and health policy in general from being associated in Canadian politics very strongly with Canadian identity. And we just had a federal electoral campaign, and it came back time and again. You know, healthcare is part of what it means to be Canadian, at least for one of the parties, it was said that clearly. With that, to start with, we can see we have this special federal structure. Plus, Canada is a dualist country, so we like to think that international law and domestic law operate in separate planes. And that gives us then this multi-layer structure. So the provinces implement, the federal law, at the federal level does policy making and sends some directions around and turns health policy into this Canadian jewel, if you want. And then there's the international level floating above. And it's not very conducive, of course, to the flow of norm, which is our topic, you know, how WHO normative instruments flow back and forth, because we have these levels and this idea that there's some separation. Plus, as you can see in the general introduction, we have a strong tradition of judicial independence with a judicial structure that is essentially inspired from English law. So what we see in the data, and on this sheet, you see the first table, which shows us that most observations that we found, and there were many, but nowhere near as many as what we saw in Brazil or what we will hear about in a moment about Costa Rica, but many observations, but mostly in case law, and of course, mostly provincial, because the action tends to be at provincial level. What it illustrates is that there's some circulation of WHO instrument via what I call a parallel channel, meaning that WHO instruments are known to experts, and these experts are involved in discussions and litigation about health policy. Therefore, these instruments show up in arguments before courts and in judgments. That happens independently of the pure, if you want, traditional legislative route. So it does illustrate the layer structure that I was mentioning and the accompanying barriers that we have on the legislative side. There are some very interesting data in the report about the repartition amongst the various provinces, amongst the ministries when it comes to legislative instruments, and amongst the court levels when it comes to case law. It's interesting, but none of it is really surprising if you look at if you know the characteristics of the Canadian system. Plus, you have this very interesting graph that shows a peak in the references that are associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, but not earlier. And again, why didn't earlier pandemics show up in our graph? I think the answer, if I go back to this layered structure, is that these pandemics did not affect Canada directly. So they were kept, in their international sphere as a WHO matter. And if you look at which instruments are cited, the last elements in our chapter, on Canada, you can see, again, considering the balance between legislation and case law and the results, way more cases than legislation, you can see that the documents that purport to reflect an expert consensus, so the classifications of diseases and so on, they show up right there in the list next to the pandemic declaration, which was obviously going to play an important role given our time period. So again, it shows the strength of this path where the WHO normative instrument doesn't go through legislative channels, but rather through expert channels, through administrations, and so on. So we were asked to look at a number of questions in our intervention. So is the data in line with expectations concerning the normative influence of the WHO on Canada? Yes, I would say they are. It's disappointing, but it's not surprising that legislation seems to be lagging behind case law so clearly. As I mentioned, I think it's a 1-2 punch. On the one hand, Canada is a global north country. We have a relatively loose and somewhat aloof attitude towards the WHO. The WHO is useful when it's directly impacting Canada, of course, when we have a COVID-19 pandemic. But WHO input must compete with the local policy leadership, and there's a lot of self-centered reflection in Canada. And when there's no direct impact, then the WHO is parked in this box at international level. So that's part of it. And the second element of this 1-2 punch is our specific constitutional and international principles that do not lead to a smooth flow in WHO legislative norms. Now, what recommendations would we make for WHO and Canadian policymakers? If you look at what is happening in Canada for the WHO, I would make a relatively technical recommendation, it may sound, but actually it's not just technical. And it would be that the WHO should really try to insist that the members systematically mention when they are acting pursuant to WHO instruments or acting in compliance with them or in accordance with them. And you would say, yeah, okay, it's to help me as a researcher. Yes, of course. But beyond that, it's to give political visibility to the WHO norms when they are used in Canada. I mean, they are used, but it's not mentioned because we feel it's international. We don't really need to refer to this. Now, for Canadian policymakers, and again, this is advice that could fit other global north countries. I think there's a tendency, if you look at the results, to treat WHO as some kind of international cooperation and international development institution, and to forget that it deals with public health more broadly, and what Canada does at WHO should be consistent with what we do internally. And the policymakers in Canada should recognize and embrace this parallel path that I described, and it shows in our data that WHO normative products, they do come into Canadian realities, but it's via the administration, via litigation, via experts, and not via legislative processes. And then what comes in is not just expert stuff, it has a normative impact as well. And lastly, we were asked to look at research paths that come out of the data regarding WHO normative leadership. And of course, when you do this, you cannot abstract from the fact that we live in a time when the US is disengaging from the WHO. So I would suggest that it would be interesting to investigate how there's more to WHO than a choice of being a member or not. It's an institution that is more embedded into reality than just as a membership option, so to say. Definitely research on the interplay between the official channels and the expert channels that shows up in the data on Canada. Research on the nature of the normative leadership of WHO and its measurements. Again, to help us researchers, of course, but to also gain a better insight of what is really happening on the ground. And also research on agenda setting to better understand the normative leadership of the WHO as a loop and not just a linear process. So in our data, we focused on how things come down from the WHO into Canadian law, but it's also interesting to investigate the back channel, what makes WHO responsive to what happens at member state level. So I will stop here for my contribution on the Canadian chapter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pierre. And also maybe a precision that I should have made earlier. But when we talk about WHO norms, we refer to soft law and hard law. So binding and non-binding norms, we looked at convention, regulation, but also advices, guidelines, and things like that. So it really is kind of a broad pot of norms that we looked at. Okay, so next, Costa Rica, we have Hugo Munoz. So Hugo Munoz is the executive director of the Food Law Research Institute in San Jose. And he hosts Passepartout, a podcast where he breaks down the technical side of food legislation for a general audience. He brings over 25 years of experience navigating complex legal system across Latin America, the US, Canada, and Europe. And he's authored several academic and professional works, including codification of European and Costa Rican food law and translated a legal dictionary focused on food law. So thank you very much for being here, Hugo. The floor is yours.
Bonjour, good morning, everyone. Thank you for this invitation. I had the opportunity to take part in this research as an independent reviewer, focusing on on its methodology and on the consistency of its conclusions. I would like to thank Professor Katherine Régis and her team for inviting me to be part of this study and this webinar. Let me start my presentation by saying how grateful I am to join this conversation, which explores a topic of growing importance, the normative role of the WHO or World Health Organization within domestic legal systems. In the next few minutes, I'll structure my remarks around three key points. First, I'll briefly examine the data on Costa Rica presented in the report. Second, I'll offer a legal and analytical interpretation of these findings, highlighting some of the structural features of Costa Rica's legal system. And finally, I'll close with a broader reflection and a key question. Let me anticipate the conclusion I'll reach. While the WHO does exert a normative influence on Costa Rica's legal system, that influence is still limited, fragmented, and deeply shaped by internal legal and institutional factors. Let's begin with the data. According to the study, Costa Rica accounts for about 17% of all legal instruments analyzed. That's almost 1,000 documents, including laws, regulations, and court decisions that refer to the WHO. For a country of its size, that's a substantial figure, placing Costa Rica among the most active in the study. These references mainly come from two institutional sources: the Ministry of Health, which issues technical regulations, and the Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court. In the judicial arena, WHO standards have been invoked in cases involving sexual and reproductive health, therapeutic abortion, access to contraceptives, vaccination policies, and of course, the legal response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The majority of these references cite non-binding instruments as technical guidelines, classification like the ICD, and general policy recommendations. Their function, however, tends to be supportive, not determinative. In other words, WHO standards are used as technical arguments, not a source of formal legal obligation. Now to the second part, a closer legal reading. This pattern reflects something deeper, a legal phenomenon known as formalism. In civil law systems like Costa Rica's, only certain sources, laws, regulations, judicial decisions are formally recognized as binding. Standards from international bodies like WHO are treated as material sources. They may inform legal reasoning, but they don't carry binding authority unless formally incorporated. To give a concrete example, a WHO guideline cannot, on its own, change national policy, restrict constitutional rights, or require action by public authorities. For that to happen, it must be adopted through a presidential decree or an executive regulation grounded in law. The requirement acts as a kind of filter, a legal barrier that limits the reach of international norms unless they've been given a domestic legal form. So, even though Costa Rica is open to international cooperation, we find that WHO standards are still received in a way that is fragmented, reactive, and often depend on legal or political crises. With this in mind, the study doesn't only tell us what is happening, it also helps us see what is missing. We can identify at least 3 challenges. For those of us interested in improving normative integration. 1. The role of judges, especially constitutional courts, in interpreting international norms in the absence of legislation. 2. The potential of administrative law to act as a flexible gateway for non-binding international standards. 3. The broader challenge of designing hybrid legal frameworks that can accommodate international soft law, while still preserving legal certainty, legitimacy, and clarity. Let me conclude with a broader reflection and a question. The pandemic revealed our deep reliance on global scientific consensus. It also reminded us that even the most well-crafted international standards may never land, legally speaking, unless national systems are prepared to receive it. So, I leave you with this. How can we design national legal systems that remain coherent and legitimate but are also more open, more responsive, and more agile in receiving normative output of international organizations at the WHO. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hugo. And the question is a very important one. I'm pretty sure Professor Habibi will have something to say about that, but we all have something to say. So let's keep that for later. In any case, before we move to France, I just wanted to say that we were all surprised by the very active norm production from Costa Rica during the research. That was a very interesting surprise, and you really help us to understand why this is the case. So thank you again. Okay, now moving to France with Gaëlle Foucault. So after completing her PhD in international law at the University of Montreal, which is a very recent thing, Gaëlle is about to begin a postdoctoral fellowship at the same institution. Her research focuses on the intersection of international law and artificial intelligence, at least for the PhD, the postdoctoral fellowship, with a particular interest in global AI governance. Our project is funded by IVADO, a Canadian consortium on AI, and Gaëlle also teaches international law and human rights at the University of Montreal and coordinates the HPOD. So thank you, Gaëlle. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So, briefly about France. Unlike Brazil and Canada and Switzerland and United States, which will be discussed later, France, like Costa Rica, is one of the unitary countries examined in this project, meaning those without a federal structure. However, what was really interesting in the French case was observing the use of WHO norms within a state context shaped by the presence of powerful regional organizations, notably the European Union. And as we will be discussing today, the graph shown on the slide clearly indicates that a significant number of references to the WHO were found in French law, which highlights that in the field of health, the WHO appears to be at least only partially challenged by the European Union. And finally, regarding the contextual aspects, it is also important to note that France is a country with a civil law tradition, so like Costa Rica, for example, and a monist system regarding international law. So now if we move on the results and corresponding analyses for France, three main findings can be emphasized. So first, in terms of the distribution of results, France is one of the few states for which a large number of regulations citing WHO were found. This finding is not so surprising given the extent of regulatory power in France, notably held by the President of the Republic. Laws are again more marginal, which, as commented by an expert in French law, should not be understood as a rejection of international law by legislative authorities, but rather as something that can be explained by the fact that French laws tend to refer more frequently to European Union law than to WHO norms. Finally, regarding the distribution of results, we can observe that court decisions are also the type of national instrument citing the WHO that most frequently found in France, even though the databases used in this research collected decisions from first instance courts in a very incomplete and partial manner. Second, it should be noted that the French case is also particularly interesting regarding the regulatory authorities referring to the WHO in their decrees or in their orders. So, as I just mentioned before, France has a very powerful regulatory authority which is shared among several actors. Specifically, when it came to identifying who exactly adopted the regulatory norms referring to the WHO, the results were diverse. Indeed, it is quite rare for a single minister to be the sole adopting authority. The counter-signature is mandatory in some cases in France and very common in others. This practice implies that multiple signatures are needed for the adoption of a regulatory act. In our case, several ministries were often behind the text citing the WHO. And here, one of the challenges in France we had, and also observed in Costa Rica, for example, is that ministries frequently changes their names and or their functions. For instance, family, sports, and health were sometimes grouped under the same ministry, while at other times they were separate. So for our analyses, we had to artificially create departments, such as, for example, the Department of Health, to properly account for the authorities responsible for the text citing WHO and to compare them with other states. Here, unsurprisingly, among the departments citing the WHO the most, the Department of Health appears first. However, many other departments also refer to WHO because of the inclusion of health in numerous policies. In particular, ecological and agricultural issues seem to have attracted the most interest in WHO norms in France, given the presence of the departments responsible for these issues at the origin of the regulations that cited the WHO. Third, and finally, interesting findings can also be shared regarding the WHO norms found in French domestic law. It must first be noted that with the other states, a wide diversity of WHO normative production has been found in domestic law. However, some WHO instruments stand out, such as the International Health Regulation, so AHR, the PHEAIC declaration in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, the WHO Constitution, and the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD, and the COVID-19 Pandemic Declaration. Here, it is relevant to point out that among these 5 most cited documents in the French law, 3 relate to health crisis. And it is also relevant to point out that all these 5 instruments have an essential normative significance. 2 are bindings, the IHR and the Constitution, and 3 have special quasi-binding normative statutes, so the Pandemic Declaration, the PHEIC Declaration, and the ICD. It is also really interesting to reveal that France is the only country among the 8 studied for which the AHR is the most frequently cited document. And here several points should be highlighted in this regard. Firstly, so while in case law, the key WHO documents relating to the COVID-19 pandemic, so the PHEIC declaration and the pandemic declaration, appear as the most cited instruments, so in case law, the AHR is completely absent. We can also deduce that also the PHEIC declaration is adopted by the Director General based on the IHR, and IHR is a binding instrument. This argument have not resulted in any mention of the IHR in case law. This assertion, however, does not apply to laws and regulation. Indeed, in French laws, the 2 declarations relating to COVID-19 have not been identified, whereas the IHR has. The case of regulations is even more interesting as the IHR is a most cited instrument, but also the PHEIC declaration. The pandemic declaration, on the other hand, is never cited by regulatory authorities. So to conclude, the importance of these WHO norms highlights that the WHO's normative leadership appears to be reflected in French law primarily during times of crisis, or at least in relation to normative instruments concerning health emergencies. So to conclude this brief presentation of our results concerning France, it is important to highlight that this country has provided interesting insights for understanding the complexity of the blending process of WHO norms into domestic law and the impact of national structure on this process. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gaëlle. Now we're moving to Switzerland, yes, with Professor Hutz. So Sandra Hutz is a professor of civil law and health law at the University of Neuchâtel, and she co-directs the Institute of Health Law. She's also been practicing as a lawyer in areas like family law and medical law, and she's a member of the Swiss Institute for Feminist Legal Studies and Gender Law. Her research mainly explores inclusive family law, reproductive self-determination, children's rights, and self-determination at the end of life. So thank you, Sandra, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction, and I would like to thank you for the report. When I went through the report today and yesterday, I really think it's great and it will help us in future. So I will talk as one of the experts who has been involved a little bit in this study. Melanie Levy, my colleague, couldn't make it today. She's the public health expert, so it is not really my field of expertise here, but as a critical commentary, I am happy to give you some thoughts. First of all, you can see here on the slide, we have federal jurisprudence and cantonal jurisprudence, which is, not surprisingly, but there is a lot of jurisprudence. And what is more surprising maybe is that we have about the same share of jurisprudence, which means that our federal system works quite well. So in Switzerland, the competence in health law lies primarily with the cantons. And if there is no special competence in specific fields, it's not the federation who takes the lead, but we still have on both levels, we have a lot of jurisprudence. You can see that we don't have a lot of laws, but as some of the speakers before said, it's not really, I don't think it's that we ignore the WHO regulation in law, but we don't we adopt the WA regulations. Because, as you know, Switzerland is not part of the EU, and what we do in our country is to adopt autonomously all legislations from the EU, and we also adopt legislation from big organizations as the WHO. So this lack of legislation, I wouldn't give too much importance to that. That's one remark, and the second remark for me is that I think we can see that among the cantons the distribution is quite unequal. We could observe in the report that only 14 of 26 cantons appear on the graph, which aligns to me with firstly the size and whether it is an urban canton or not, and the size and the urbanness of a canton correlates also with the expertise. And I think this expertise reflects then also in what you found in the data of what kind of courts referenced the WHO. So you could see on page 86 that the Insurance Court of the Canton of Zurich has the most citations of the WHO regulations or references, whatever it is then. And this is this makes sense, because the more specialized, the more expertise there is in a specialized court, the more references you will find. So I think this is a nice picture. And what kind of conclusions can we take from there? That if we have specialized courts, and we don't have the specialized courts in the little cantons, we will also have more international legal influence. This is the second point. And then the third point, which I found very interesting, is that what type of WHO documents did you find? First of all, you found that the one document that is cited the most is the International Classification of Diseases, and this again is connected to the fact that of the reimbursement of the insurance system. So the insurance courts will cite the ICD because all the diseases which are then reimbursed are funded in the ICD. So this makes all very much sense, and it's interesting to see in this clarity. And if you ask me now what kind of recommendations I would give, is as a research recommendation, I would say try to investigate the legislation processes, not only the laws, because maybe in legislation processes we can find this link to the WHO regulations and documents a little bit more. This is this type of autonomous adaptation of foreign law we have in Switzerland. And if you ask me about how can we optimize the integration or how can we foster the impact, then I would say the fact we already see here that the fact that WHO is in Switzerland helps. So it also helps to have really written documents, to have such kind of reports being sent to the policy players, to courts, and everything which is written down then will help the integration later. Thank you very much. I'm open to all questions concerning Switzerland.
Thank you very much, Sandra. We're going to move to the US now because we don't have that much time. So it's going to be presented by Katherine Ginsbach. Katherine is a senior associate with the Center for Transformational Health Law at the O'Neill Institute in Georgetown University. Prior to joining the O'Neill Institute, she worked as a medical legal partnership attorney at the Alaska Native Medical Center. She is also a member of the Colorado Bar. Her primary research area include pandemic preparedness and response legislation, global health governance, and disease surveillance. So Kate, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Catherine. Good morning, and thank you for having me. As we've heard, this is important research highlighting the importance of WHO at a time when some countries, especially the US, are turning towards nationalism. So to give you some context, the US is a federalist system where the public health power resides in the states. We have no right to health, and healthcare is heavily privatized. At the federal level, we do see military and indigenous healthcare being administered at the federal level, but even public systems like Medicaid and Medicare are administered by the states. And states are responsible for controlling the practices of various healthcare professionals. So when looking at US regulations and laws, regulations are typically a rule that is created by a government agency to implement a law and provides a specific detail on a law, whereas a law is to be enforced, whereas laws are created by legislative bodies, and we federal and national level as well. As for decisions we see most cited, the document being the International Classification of Disease, and I think this was cited most heavily throughout most of the countries, but the ICD really provides a standardization way of classifying and reporting disease data, enabling the tracking of trends and the identification of at-risk solutions. And this is a really crucial document for public health interventions, policy development, and resource allocation. And it provides a more granular view of health conditions, enabling policymakers to develop targeted interventions and strategies. So thinking about how the ICDs are incorporated in the US, ICD codes are essential for creating a standardization of disease classification among states for reimbursement in the health insurance industry, including our public health insurance systems like Medicaid and Medicare. And then when thinking about being cited in court cases, there's an element of how litigious the US is and the integration of the ICD into potential medical malpractice lawsuits. And outside of that, most of what we see in terms of the normative production cited included, not including the COVID-19 pandemic, really focuses on the standardization and classification documents, creating a uniform system throughout the US. But looking beyond that to the departments that are being cited, I think it makes sense among most countries that the most heavily cited is the Department of Health and Human Services. 29% of that category is referenced to the WHO. But looking at some of the other departments, I think it was maybe slightly surprising to those outside of the US, which ones took up a large percentage point. The Department of Labor, 22% of the documents were cited there, and really thinking about like OSHA standards and the integration of worker safety and working conditions. And then Department of Agriculture actually oversees and provides leadership on our food safety, healthy diets, nutrition, and food standards, as well as the Department of Transportation. It really works on the policy to address road safety. And for example, at the WHO, the Global Plan for the Decade Ahead for Road Safety outlines recommendations for improving road safety globally, but really emphasizing this need for coordination efforts from various stakeholders, including the DOT. And I think beyond that, we really see this federalist system at play with the World Directory for Medical Schools, Pharmacy, Dental Schools appearing as one of the most cited documents in the US state law. So at the subnational level, each state determines their own accreditation process. So when developing guidelines, it makes sense that are looking for guidance to determine the minimum baselines for training and practices of health professionals. And really thinking about future impacts of WHO norms in our country, I think that with Trump pulling out of the WHO, we aren't entirely sure what that is going to look like and what ultimately the impact will have, both short term and long term. I will say, though, that I think as the US, being primarily the federal government, turns away from science, technical guidance, and evidence-based decisions, I think we will see more integration of WHO guidance and policy into subnational laws and regulations. Individuals and departments will be looking for credible sources to build policy, and I don't think we can entirely trust what is currently being put out by entities in our government at the moment. And I think in terms of future research opportunities, I think it would be really interesting to maybe take this a step further and look at the integration of WHO policy and guidance at the subnational level and the impacts of the on-the-ground implementation that is happening there. But I'll stop now and look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. So we are all wondering what's going to happen with the US, especially in the context of the WHO. So looking forward to continue this conversation for sure. Next is going to be the final remarks by Roojin Habibi. We're going to have a bit of time, maybe one or two questions could be taken. So please put them in the chat. Okay, so now going back to Roojin. So she is an assistant professor at the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Law, Common Law section. She's a senior visiting fellow of the United Nations University's International Institute for Global Health and a research fellow of the Global Strategy Lab based at York University and the University of Ottawa. In 2022, she was appointed by the WHO Director General to the high-profile review committee regarding amendments to the international health regulations, providing technical recommendations to WHO member states. Thank you so much for being here, Roojin, and I'll leave you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Régis, and I hope my sound is okay, coming through clearly.
It's perfect.
Excellent. Wonderful. So thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's really a pleasure and such a treat for me. We rarely see reports of this sort, and those of us who work in the global health space really have an opportunity to geek out when they are released. So I'm really delighted. I would also like to heartily congratulate Professor Régis, Gaëlle Foucault, Julie Nicolas, Miriam Cohen, Jean-Louis Dennis, Pierre Larouche, Sandra Hotz, Hugo, Munoz, Katherine Ginsbach, and all other colleagues who've worked and who I've missed, who took part of this and supported this crucial report. So I really, really appreciate this opportunity to speak to it. And I think, I guess the first thing I'll say as a sort of to cap the discussions that were had is that WHO has had broad founding ambitions, right? According to its Article 2A of its constitution, the WHO aspires to act as the directing and coordinating authority on international health work. And it also understands international health under its preamble, as this report notes, as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So it has this expansive mandate, and it was born in a world which was a world that is very different from the world we live in today. It was born in the wake of the Second World War against the horrors of the Holocaust, and was a dramatically different one. And the one we see today seems that it has lost the appreciation for WHO's identity, for WHO's birth, and the conditions that gave rise to the World Health Organization to begin with. As Professor Régis and colleagues rightly note, WHO is facing a crisis of confidence, a crisis of antagonism. And there's a rapid shift that's taken place. And it seems like there's just one thing after another that is hitting the WHO, which is bad news for it. Much of this is, and we can't sugarcoat it, instigated or maybe triggered by discussions that are happening in the United States. There's been a notice of withdrawal that has been given by the United States. And so presumably in a year's time from that notice, they will no longer be part of the World Health Organization. Argentina seems to have also taken an approach down this route, though it doesn't have the same legal loophole that the WHO has. Nonetheless, these are not all just symbolic acts, but they are deeply destabilizing ones. Even if a country remains part of the WHO, but voices its opposition and says, we are not going to pay up our fees, there's really nothing the WHO can do other than take away the voting powers of that country at the World Health Assembly. And so as a result of the US withdrawal, for instance, we're seeing the WHO faces a funding shortfall of $600 million through the end of 2025, nearly $2 billion over the 2026-2027 biennium. Member states have made some discussions over the World Health Assembly to increase their assessed contributions, but that still remains, there still remains some serious discussions around what WHO can do. And it has had an expansive normative authority. Should it be reining back that normative authority? And so this report really comes at this moment, and I consider this to be a very crucial report for this moment. It is a report that helps us see in practice something that is very often missing in discussions around the World Health Organization and the ways in which we talk about how great it is. What we often lack in these discussions is that on the ground impact, that on the ground, how does it actually translate to the health of the people on a day-to-day basis in communities where they live? And this report isn't just crucial because of that, but also because of the global health reforms that have just been concluded. As Professor Régis noted in her opening, there's a new pandemic agreement that has been adopted at the World Health Assembly just a couple of days ago. And that will be open for signature and will require ratification and will require domestic implementation once the details of a pathogen access and benefit sharing mechanism are worked out. Of course, there's also the amendments to the international health regulations that were adopted in 2024 that will enter into force in September of this year. And that too will require domestic implementation. So lots of attention will soon be paid to how the normative authorities of WHO enter and trickle down at the domestic level. But of course, as Professor Régis has noted, this is not just about hard laws that are integrating and influencing countries, but also soft laws. And very often the soft laws in the global health space are the ones that tend to have the most impact for a variety of reasons that I won't be able to get into. I'm conscious of the time, so I'll try to go a little bit more quickly, but the last thing I'll say just about this report is that it's of great value, not just because of the practicalities of it, but as a piece of study for international law scholars more generally outside of the health domain. Health is a famously complex and technical area of international law. It's one that this report very clearly shows can span many different sectors of society beyond the ministries of health. And so how international law gets downloaded into domestic settings is a really, really interesting, so for general international law scholars, is a very interesting case to examine more deeply as well. The last thing I'll say just quickly on the interesting bits of this report is the multi-level interaction that occurs between various branches of government and the WHO's norms. We see, for instance, that provincial and subnational entities can often be the ones that reference WHO more often than even the federal or national institutions and governments. And that in and of itself is interesting because in federalist societies in particular, it is normally the federal branch of government that is interfacing with international health commitments. And so how that dialogue is arising between provinces and subnational entities and the international is a very fascinating process, and one that certainly requires more in-depth examination. I'll just note on three key things that are maybe useful points of future work to build on, or work to build on the basis of this report. And one of them is around the developments of regionalization in global health. So we're heading towards this world that wants to critique WHO, that wants to say that WHO has failed in the COVID response, or that has done this and not done that, not fulfilled its mandate. Countries are very critical of WHO, and some of that critique is spilling over into developing regional mechanisms for global health, for responses to health emergencies, for instance. I'll bring up just the example of the WHO's Public Health Emergency of International Concern function, which is under the international health regulations. This is the FIC that Dr. Foucault was also referring to. The FIC mechanism, the Public Health Emergency of International Concern, was one that was integrated in the international health regulations in the wake of SARS, when it became necessary for the world to have a global alert mechanism to health emergencies internationally. What has transpired with the function of a FIC in the years since the 2005 IHR was adopted is that it has failed some countries and maybe not others. And by some countries here, I mean in particular countries in Africa and that went through the experience of Ebola and saw that the fight function was declared far too late for them because maybe something that was only an outbreak within a few countries in the depths of Africa did not matter as much to maybe global countries. And so what that has done, the 2014-2016 Ebola outbreak in West Africa basically gave African countries an awakening and to develop the Africa CDC. Now the Africa CDC has normative authorities as well to declare a public health emergency of continental, I think, security effects. And so what that means is that we're now seeing competing authorities around health emergency declarations. And so this type of report is crucial, and one can build on it further to examine how regionalization is affecting WHO's normative authorities as well. The second piece I think that is useful as an analysis to build on, and I'm sure based on the rich data set you have all developed, this will be further analysis coming, is the understanding of the landing process of norms. I really liked this concept that was introduced in the report. And I think that there's lots of room to build a very rich qualitative analysis of the landing process of norms. Some of this has already been stated in various comparative case studies that have been presented. I'll just name only a few. And one of those I'll name is this piece around countries adopting laws and policies that seem to be in sync with WHO, but somehow just don't reference it, right? And here I'm thinking, for instance, of Canada's tobacco control laws, how they are stronger often than the FCTC norms, but don't necessarily explicitly make reference to the FCTC in their text. And so what does that say about how norms land domestically? I think pieces around the intermediaries, for instance, experts, as Professor Larouche brought up, or even just legislative debates, examining those a little bit more closely, as Professor Holtz had noted, I think those are very much rich fodder for a qualitative analysis and ones that will really help make the case for WHO why we need a strong, robust, and independent WHO in the world still. The last piece of it that I'll say, and I'll close here just to give opportunity as well for questions, because I know that there's folks online who have lots to maybe build on as well, is this piece around I wonder the extent to which resources in a country affect how much they draw on WHO's normative authorities. The countries that are examined in this report, there's a range in terms of GDP, but very low income countries, I wonder to what extent, because of the fact that their government apparatus may be lower on resources, to what extent they need to draw from WHO's normative authorities, to what extent they need to rely on technical advice from WHO, and whether it is different from maybe middle income or high income countries in the way they engage with WHO. I'm thinking here, of course, of many African countries, but also, of course, many in Asia and Latin America as well. The last piece of this is just to say that there was a 2024 evaluation report. As I was preparing my remarks here, I came across a 2024 WHO evaluation report too, which examines I wouldn't say it's the same, but it examines how WHO's normative authority is taking place in Ethiopia, Jordan, Maldives, Pakistan, Philippines, Rwanda, Uganda. So it's lovely that they're not the same country. So we have even a richer data set to draw on. And I would just say that there's a lot that report validates in this report that has been issued and been developed by colleagues here, right? The conclusions they land on are very similar. And the conclusion is that WHO does not currently monitor systematically the use of its normative products. If it did so, then it would allow for a process of dialogue, not just understanding how law gets implemented from the top down, but also understanding how law can, from the bottom up, inform WHO's policies, right? I think there's a two-way street here that we need to further build on, and this type of work is exactly the type of thing that can help us do that. So I will just stop there and just warmly again congratulate colleagues on this fantastic report and for letting me be part of a small piece of the discussion, and looking forward to the questions to come. Thank you so much, Professor Régis.
Thank you very much, Professor Habibi. I'm going to say a few things, but then I'm going to leave the floor to the others if they want to comment on what you just said and what the others said as well. First of all, just talking about the recent WHO report on the normative function as well. So we were in touch, and of course, we were independent researchers, so we did our things on our side, but we were able to share our methodological hurdles because this kind of research is very complex and methodology-wise, and it could be very expensive as well. And we chose different paths for doing the research. So it's really nice to be complementary. And as you mentioned, a lot of the conclusions are at the end of the day similar, although we explore different countries, but we need to stay in that track of research. Regarding the point on the lending process, and we also thought it was really interesting, not only from an empirical perspective, but from a theoretical perspective, and what we already had in the literature in that regarding that process. And what we discover is, and Pierre briefly touched upon this, is it's not necessarily a vertical process. It really is kind of a more circular process. So you gain insight from what the countries are doing, and then it goes back to the WHO, and it can change at the end of the day how they formulate the next norms and adapt the normative process. So it really is more of a circular process, and we're still working on this, but stay tuned because this is our next paper actually. And the other thing is, before I open the floor to the others, is maybe on the positive side, we did some quantitative work which is mostly what this report described. We also did qualitative work with the interviews, and which is going to be mentioned in other papers as well. But the last question we asked during our interviews, even with people who were really critical of WHO, it's a tough spot to be on. You're leading something that is almost impossible to lead, and you have to dance with the member states, and so. But at the end of the day, we asked the question to all the people we interviewed. So if WHO were to disappear, what would happen? And everybody was kind of they were all on the same page. Like, well, even if I have some critiques, it cannot disappear. It really has a unique role and something that could not be replaced in any ways. I guess the sweet spot is to find what is so unique about WHO, especially in the context of financial pressure. Well, they would probably have to give up some, functions, I would say. Hopefully not, but maybe this is what will happen. But it was more about finding that spot where it is unique, and we just need to improve what it does in that sweet spot. But they were all, yeah, no, it cannot disappear. So regarding the financial component, and I will end with this, during the interviews, that's something that came up in different ways. So obviously the states don't have the same financial capacities, and it does indeed, based on the interviews, influence how the norms the norms of WHO. For some countries, because they don't have the same financial capacity with their legal system and health system, they more directly take the norms of WHO as something they integrate directly in their system. And the other way around, or maybe a different path to that, is for some countries, they say, well, there are so many norms, and because we don't have that financial capacity that we wish we had, we have to pick and choose. So it creates more of a, because we cannot implement everything, and WTO's norms don't always come with financial capacity to implement. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. We really need to be super careful or strategic in what makes sense for us. So the financial component is there for sure, but it can play differently. Perhaps, Pierre, do you want to comment on the expertise? Because I think it's a key point of the research, actually, the role of experts. And that's something that I think I wonder about the US, the fact that they send their notice of withdrawal, and they will probably have a different role for sure, actually, in WHO. A lot of their experts actually play a significant role at the WHO. So in the context of their withdrawal, I think their influence in global health will also maybe impact by this. So
Sure. Yeah, I think it's actually, I mean, I think it's something a lot of us are thinking about of like what exactly this will look like. And kind of thinking about how this document was integrated into US policy and guidance and the role that like the US CDC has as well in developing policy and guidance and just thinking about how close like the CDC and WHO have worked together on certain things. Like I know of colleagues who have done details at WHO and kind of just like this pipeline that's existing. We saw some holdups around like the virus selections for flu vaccines, whether or not the US was party or able to tap into the GIS network. And I think there's a lot of these hurdles that we'll just be encountering for a while. I also think the individual expertise is really critical right now in the US, especially just to remain engaged and remain a pillar as Trump is trying to weaken the global norms that are being have been established and have really been pillars for such a long time. And I think we are seeing this movement within the scientific community to try and capture the data we have and capture the information. But I think as was noted, I don't like there's not a replacement for the WHO. And we've seen this, even in this increasing global health stage of so many actors, the WHO really remains the one entity where all countries have a voice and one vote. And so I don't really know where that leaves the US. But I do remain hopeful that like while we may be taking a step back, other countries are in a position to step forward and to really move this agenda around global health and health systems and norms that are being established and standardized. And so that, hopefully at the point that Trump gets out of office and we're kind of able to re-engage that the agenda is still moving forward. And I think that will happen. I think the US is certainly dealing with our own unfortunate can of worms, but I do remain hopeful that there are so many countries that are willing to like pick up the baton and I think we've seen it with Roojin mentioning, Ethiopia, Uganda, some of those other countries that are integrating WHO norms. And I think the world is certainly ready for other countries to step forward and step into that hole that the US is creating. I don't know if that really answers your question. I think a lot of us just have a lot of probably not fully formed thoughts about what's happening. It's a really unfortunate time, but do really appreciate the work that you're doing. And I think, as everybody's highlighted just how important it is that this research is out there showing um, how integral the WHO really is, not even at the federal level, but like going to subnational or even, I think you would even see like an increase of adoption at the municipal level. I know where I lived during COVID, they were certainly looking to the WHO for guidance as everybody was. So just really appreciate everybody's comments and support as we all figure this out.
thank you, Kate. Any other comments?
Well,
yeah,
if I may, so Katherine, not to pick on this point, but I wanted to ask you. So, when the U.S. withdrew, immediately they also issued an order on US officials, not to take part. And I thought, okay, well, they're clever than I thought. They figured out that there's more to membership than a piece of paper. But still, how far will it reach? I mean, there are probably thousands of people doing work on health in the US that somehow are in contact with the WHO. So can they all be prevented from being in contact? And on the other hand, WHO information is also public, so you cannot prevent people from taking it into account. They won't acknowledge it. That doesn't help us for this type of research project. But how far do you think it will reach? Will the US become a complete island, or it's just whatever has an official label will be discontinued, but a lot of other things will keep on happening?
I mean, I think
30 seconds, Katherine.
yeah, I think the hope really is that it is just a show. But I will say the icing that happened after the administration took office was so quick. And I think it really took a lot of us by surprise. I worked closely with people at CDC and Health and Human Services, and there was about 3 months that I was not allowed to have any official communication with them. So I think and those are being rolled back. And I think we have seen quite a few like statements come out, but then the work does actually continue. But I will say I have not been privy to an administration that moves so quickly and so forcefully when it came to silencing the science that's happening. So that's I could definitely talk for hours about this, but I will pause now because I know we're very close to time.
That will be for our next seminar, I guess. So at this point, I just want to thank you all so much for your extremely relevant remarks and your participation in this project, and Gaëlle for organizing this seminar. So thank you. Please read the report and stay tuned for more work in this sphere. And have a wonderful day. Thank you all.